The diner was alive with the sound of clinking cups and soft jazz. But when Aaliyah, the black waitress, walked toward table 5, her steps slowed. The man sitting there wasn't just another customer. He was Ethan Cartwright, a billionaire real estate tycoon from New York, dressed sharp even on a sleepy Georgia morning. But it wasn't his money or attitude that froze her, it was his tattoo. As he rolled up his sleeve to reach for his coffee, the elegant Japanese letters on his wrist caught the light. They looked familiar, painfully familiar. Aaliyah blinked twice, her tray trembling in her hands. She'd seen those symbols before in her grandmother's handwriting lessons. Her heart skipped. The man smiled proudly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, catching her stare. "It means eternal love. My late wife's memory stays with me through this." Aaliyah's throat went dry. Her pulse raced. She wasn't sure if she should speak, but the truth clawed its way out anyway. "Sir, that doesn't mean eternal love." The billionaire froze mid-sip. "Excuse me." She swallowed hard. "Those characters, they say grilled meat lunch set." The air around the table seemed to stop moving. A nearby customer looked up. The laughter from the back booth died instantly. The billionaire's daughter blinked in confusion, her tiny voice whispering, "Daddy?" His expression hardened. "You must be mistaken," he said sharply, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I wish I was," Aaliyah whispered. His voice rose. "Are you calling me a fool? Do you have any idea how much this tattoo cost?" The little girl's face fell. The waitress stepped back, clutching the tray, but the damage was done. The man's pride burned hotter than the coffee on the counter. A hush fell over the diner. Everyone watching a quiet truth explode in slow motion. A black waitress had just corrected a billionaire in public, and his ego couldn't take it. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. Aaliyah lowered her eyes, whispering, "I didn't mean to embarrass you, sir." But his pride was louder than her apology. He slammed his hand on the table. Silverware rattled. "You don't know what you're talking about." And with that, the first spark of truth turned the whole room silent. The silence inside the diner was heavy, thick enough to feel. Every pair of eyes shifted from the trembling black waitress to the furious billionaire who towered above her booth. Aaliyah gripped the edge of her tray, trying to steady her shaking hands. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Sir, I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I just..." "Enough!" Ethan snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You people think you know everything." The word stung. You people. It wasn't the first time she'd heard them, but from a man who wore a wedding ring and a 20,000 watch, they landed harder. She took a step back, her heart pounding. The coffee pot in her hand tilted without her noticing, and the scalding liquid spilled across her wrist. She gasped. The pot clattered to the floor. Pain shot up her arm as she bit down a cry. Ethan blinked, his anger faltering for half a heartbeat. But then his pride rose again. "Watch where you're going," he muttered coldly. From the next booth, an elderly Japanese man slowly stood. His silver hair gleamed under the warm diner lights, and his voice carried calm authority. "Excuse me," he said gently. "The young woman is correct." Ethan turned, his face tightening. "What did you just say?" "I said she's right," the man repeated. "Those symbols on your arm, they mean grilled meat lunch set. It's a common phrase. Nothing romantic about it." The billionaire's face drained of color. Around them, quiet murmurs rippled through the diner. A trucker snorted behind his menu. A woman at the counter covered her mouth. Aaliyah wanted to disappear. The burn on her wrist throbbed, but the humiliation in the air hurt more. Ethan clenched his jaw, glaring at the old man, then at Aaliyah. He threw a $100 bill onto the table. Too much for the meal, too little for his pride. "Keep the change," he hissed, grabbing his daughter's hand. "We're leaving." The bell over the door jingled as they stormed out into the rain. The moment they were gone, the tension broke like glass. Aaliyah stood frozen, her wrist red, her heart bruised. The old man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "Truth can wound pride, but lies wound the soul." Her eyes glistened as she whispered, then why does doing right still hurt this bad? Rain poured down outside as Ethan Cartwright's black Mercedes cut through the Savannah streets. His jaw was tight, hands locked on the steering wheel. His daughter sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her pink lunchbox, watching her father through wide, worried eyes. He'd faced hostile boardrooms and billion-dollar lawsuits without flinching, but the voice of that waitress echoed in his head. It says grilled meat lunch set. Every repetition burned deeper. Shame twisted inside him like a knife. His daughter finally whispered, "Daddy, was she lying?" Ethan exhaled through his nose, staring ahead. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. She wasn't lying. Back at the diner, Aaliyah sat in the break room, her wrist wrapped in a damp towel. The pain had dulled, but her heart still ached. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the burn or the way he'd looked at her, like truth itself was an insult. Her manager, Rick, a man with kind eyes and a baseball cap that had seen better days, crouched beside her. "You want to go home, kid?" She shook her head. "No, I'm fine." Rick frowned. That guy was way out of line. "Don't let him make you question doing the right thing." "I just didn't want to embarrass him," she murmured. "But I couldn't lie. My grandma always said if a word is wrong, it poisons everything around it." From a corner of the room, the elderly Japanese man, Mr. Sakamoto, stepped in quietly. His presence carried a kind calm that filled the space. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," he said. "In Japan, we call that kodadama, the spirit of the word. Words carry souls. You use yours with honesty." Aaliyah smiled faintly, her eyes wet. It didn't feel like honesty helped anyone today. Mr. Sakamoto tilted his head. "Not yet, but sometimes truth has to hurt before it heals. Give it time." Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his study later that night, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls. He poured himself a drink, rolled up his sleeve, and stared at the ink. Eternal love. The lie mocked him now. He whispered into the quiet, "Catherine, I just wanted to honor you. How'd I get this so wrong?" Thunder rumbled outside, soft but endless. Across town, Aaliyah whispered her grandmother's photo. Did I do the right thing? Neither of them knew yet. This mistake was about to change both their lives. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The next morning, the diner smelled of fresh biscuits and coffee again, as if yesterday's storm had never happened. But Aaliyah still felt the sting on her wrist, and in her heart, she tied her apron, telling herself it was just another workday. Then the bell over the door jingled. Her breath caught. Standing there, in a simple gray sweater instead of suit, was Ethan Cartwright, the same billionaire who had humiliated her 24 hours ago. He looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. His voice was low, careful. "I came to apologize." Aaliyah blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. The room went quiet again, like the world itself was eavesdropping. He continued, "I yelled at you, I disrespected you, and I'm sorry." She crossed her arms, still guarded. "You call me just a waitress." Ethan nodded, "And that was wrong. You told me the truth, and I punished you for it. That's not strength. That's ego." For the first time, she saw his hands trembling. His cuff was unbuttoned, the tattoo visible again, those same Japanese letters staring back at them both. "You still wearing it?" she asked softly. He glanced down. "Yeah, I thought about erasing it last night, but maybe I needed to face it instead." A small, almost sad smile touched her lips. "Good, because a mistake isn't the ink. It's the meaning you gave it." He looked at her, puzzled. "Meaning? You wanted it to say eternal love," she said. "But love isn't just what you write down. It's what you live through, even when it hurts." Ethan exhaled slowly, as if those words reached a place therapy never had. "You sound like someone who's had to forgive people who didn't deserve it." "More than once," she said. For the first time, they both laughed. Quiet, real laughter. It didn't erase the past, but it made the moment human. Before leaving, Ethan placed a small envelope on the counter. "For your wrist," he said, "and for your patience." She opened it after he walked out. Inside was a handwritten note. "Real love survives translation." Aaliyah smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Maybe it does." By afternoon, the story had already escaped the diner's four walls. Someone had filmed the moment. The billionaire's outrage, the quiet waitress's truth. Within hours, headlines started popping up online. Billionaire's tattoo blunder goes viral. Eternal love or lunch special? Ethan stared at his phone, scrolling in disbelief. News anchors were laughing, commentators dissecting every second. His name, his grief, had become a meme. He sat in his study, the blinds half closed. For the first time in years, the silence around him felt heavier than money could fix. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You okay?" He hesitated, then typed back. "Not sure yet. The internet thinks I'm an idiot." "Aaliyah, you're not. You're just visible now." That single word, visible, hit deeper than any insult could. For once, people weren't seeing the billionaire. They were seeing the man beneath the fortune. Cracked, but real. Across town, Aaliyah sat on the diner's back step, her bandaged wrist resting on her lap. She reread his message, wondering how a moment of humiliation had turned into the strange thread of understanding. She typed again. "When I was 16, I tried to tattoo my mom's name myself. Got it backwards. I still have the scar." His reply came after a pause. "Did you ever fix it?" "No," she wrote. "Some mistakes don't need fixing. They just need meaning." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Then, for the first time since his wife's death, he smiled, small, tired, but real. Later that night, he sat at the edge of his daughter's bed while she colored on the floor. She looked up innocently. "Daddy, why are people talking about your arm?" He chuckled softly. "Because I made a silly mistake." She giggled. "Mommy would have laughed too. She liked when you messed up." He nodded, eyes stinging. "Yeah, she did." She handed him a small drawing, a red heart with 3 crooked lines inside it. "See? That's Mommy's laugh. You can put it with your tattoo so it feels right again." Ethan's throat tightened. He folded the paper gently and whispered, "You're smarter than most grown-ups I know." That night, he placed her drawer beside the envelope from Aaliyah, 2 small reminders that truth, even when it hurts, always leads somewhere honest. The next week, Ethan Cartwright sat in a TV studio under bright lights, his wrist hidden under his cuff. The world already knew the story. The billionaire who thought his tattoo said eternal love, but it really meant grilled meat lunch set. When the cameras rolled, the host smiled politely. "Mr. Cartwright, this mistake made headlines across the world. How does it feel to be the man behind the most famous mistranslation on the internet?" He chuckled softly. "Humbling," he said. "But it also reminded me that grief doesn't need perfection. It just needs honesty." A photo appeared on the screen behind him. The tattoo, now with new words written underneath in simple block letters, "Still loving." The host leaned forward. "You added this recently?" "Yes," Ethan said, "because love isn't about getting it right every time. It's about owning your mistakes and still choosing to love anyway." Across town, Aaliyah watched the interview from the diner's small TV above the counter. She froze when he mentioned her name. "The waitress who told me the truth." Ethan said to the camera, "She reminded me that honesty, even when it hurts, is a form of love. I owe her more than I can say." The diner went quiet. Rick whistled low. "Well, look at that. You're famous now, kid." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "I didn't do it to be famous." "No," Rick said. "You did it because you got a backbone." Later that evening, Aaliyah received a text. "Ethan, there's a charity event next week, in my wife's name, for families dealing with grief. I'd like you to come, if you let me thank you properly." She stared at the message for a long moment. Her heart said yes before her mind caught up. "I'll think about it," she finally replied. The night of the event arrived sooner than expected. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, wearing a simple navy dress, unsure she belonged among all the suits and chandeliers. When Ethan saw her, He smiled. Not like a billionaire greeting a stranger, but like a man seeing someone who changed his life. He extended his hand. I was hoping you'd show up. Aaliyah took it softly. I wasn't sure if I'd fit in here. He shook his head. You fit anywhere truth is welcome. The ballroom lights dimmed and a hush settled over the crowd. On stage, a banner read, "Still loving, a night of healing, truth, and humanity." Ethan Cartwright stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, grounded. 5 years ago, I got a tattoo to honor my late wife. I thought it said eternal love. Turns out, it meant grilled meat lunch set. Laughter rippled through the audience, gentle and understanding. He smiled. I was angry, embarrassed, until someone brave enough told me the truth. A waitress named Aaliyah, who reminded me that truth, even when it burns, can still heal. Applause filled the room. Aaliyah stood in the wings, her heart racing. Ethan motioned toward her. She's here tonight. And if you take anything from this story, let it be this. Sometimes the person society overlooks is the one who hands you your mirror. The crowd turned as Aaliyah walked onto stage. For a moment, she hesitated, but the warmth in the room carried her forward. She took the mic, her voice steady but emotional. I didn't plan to change anyone's life that day, she said softly. I just saw something wrong and spoke up. Truth doesn't belong to the rich or the powerful. It belongs to whoever's brave enough to say it out loud. The audience went silent. Ethan smiled proudly from behind her. Aaliyah continued, That day, I learned something too, that love doesn't need perfect words to be real. Sometimes it shows up as honesty, even if it stings first. Applause rose again, not polite, but heartfelt. People stood, clapping until she looked down, humbled. After the speeches, they stood together near a small memorial photo of Ethan's late wife. Aaliyah looked at the framed picture and whispered, She must have been something special. Ethan nodded, eyes misty. She was, and I think she'd have liked you. Aaliyah smiled. Then I'll take that as an honor. He rolled up his sleeve, showing the tattoo now complete. The Japanese character still bold, and beneath them, the English phrase freshly inked, still loving. Aaliyah reached out and lightly touched his wrist. That's the real translation now. He smiled. Yeah, thanks to you. Outside, the night air was soft and golden. The world felt quieter, kinder. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.